Previously, we looked at all the Createx reducers that are available, as well as what Createx recommends for percentages when it comes to reduction ratios. In this video, I want to examine how all those reduction ratios actually perform. I'll show you how I mix my paint, and in the end, I will share with you the reduction ratio, the air pressure settings that work really well for me for about 90% of what I do. So we have a recommendation to add reducer to our paint somewhere in the range of between 5 and 30% per volume. If you don't know what those ratios actually look like, I'm going to give them to you. So here's what I've done. Off camera, I mixed up ratios between 10 and 50% per volume. So that's just a Wicked Blue, and all of that paint was reduced with the 4011 reducer. The reason I mixed up all this paint off camera is because it actually took some time. I wanted to be as accurate as I possibly could in order to get a good, fair comparison. So I actually used a syringe to measure out each part of paint as well as each part of reducer. This is not how I normally reduce my paint, and we'll go over that in just a little bit. But again, it's accurate and it gives us a fair comparison, because the plan for now is I have two columns on this sheet of paper. On one side, I want to spray each reduction ratio with my Iwata HPCS Eclipse. This has a 0.35 millimeter needle and nozzle set, which is mid-range as far as airbrushes are concerned. My air pressure is set at 25 psi. 25 psi is pretty much where my compressor lives for about 90% of what I do, and it will remain set there for the remainder of this video. In the second column, I will use my Iwata Micron CMC. This has a 0.18 millimeter needle and nozzle set, so it's considered the smaller tip size airbrush. So we'll get a good comparison between a mid-range airbrush and a small tipped airbrush with all these different reduction ratios. You may have noticed that I didn't mix up a 5% per volume ratio. A 5% per volume reduction ratio equates to about 19 to 1, or 19 parts paint to 1 part reducer. You could also use a 9 to half, or 9 parts paint to a half part of a reducer. A 10% per volume ratio equates to 9 to 1, 9 parts paint, 1 part reducer. The difference between a 5 and 10% ratio is negligible, so I elected to go with 10% through a 50% per volume ratio. So I'll put some paint in my airbrushes and we'll get to spraying. The very first thing I want to test is how well the airbrush is actually atomizing the paint, and I can do that very simply by just making a dot. So what we're looking for is very fine droplets of paint, so much so that you get a very smooth gradation or fade out. And that's what we have here. So the Iwata Eclipse is atomizing the paint just fine at a 10% per volume reduction ratio. The next thing I want to test is if the paint is going to start and stop when I want it to. So to do this, I'm just going to make some lines. The object here is I'm trying to make these lines approximately the same width, but I'm also looking for consistency, and I don't have the consistency. So what's happening is, because the paint is so thick, I'm having to pull the trigger back farther than I normally would in order to get the paint to flow at 25 psi. You can see the results are somewhat erratic with my lines. There's a little bit of a skip right there, and the tail end of all of these lines is heavier and thicker than the start. And again, that's because I'm having to pull the trigger back farther than normal in order to get the paint to flow with the viscosity of a 10% reduction. So I've swapped to the Micron now, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. Starting with a dot. Followed by some lines. Now hopefully you can see that the Micron is actually spraying a 10% reduction better than the 0.35 Eclipse was. You can see a little bit of inconsistency in these lines. There's a heavier spot on the tail end of that one, heavier spot on the tail end of that one. But overall, these are far more consistent compared to the lines that were sprayed with the Eclipse. Now again, I'm still having to pull the trigger back on the Micron farther than I normally would for the same reason, because this paint is thicker than what I normally work with. So I've switched to the 15% mix. Gonna do the same thing, starting with a dot. Much better than the 10% reduction ratio, but we still have some work to do. Again, same thing, a dot followed by some lines. I have to say I'm pretty impressed with the Micron. I don't know that I've ever attempted to spray paint with that little reduction through any of my Microns before, and it's performing really, really well considering. I didn't think it would do as well as it's doing. Now I've switched back to the Eclipse. I'm at a 20% per volume reduction ratio and will continue doing the same thing. You can clearly see that the Eclipse is performing far better at a 20% reduction ratio. I think we can still do better, but we've come a long way from where we started. And now back to the Micron. So there are a couple skips with the Micron. I noticed one there and one there, but overall the performance is really coming around. So we're moving in the right direction. We're making progress, but we're not quite there yet. Both of these can still improve by a lot. So next we'll go ahead and do the same thing with the 25%. So I noticed a slight improvement at the 25%. It's not huge, and I didn't expect it to be when we're only jumping from 5% increments, but it is quite a bit smoother on both sides, and I'm noticing that I'm not having to pull the trigger back as far to get the paint to flow. So we'll keep going. We have now moved beyond what Createx recommends as far as reduction ratios are concerned. We are at 35%. And that's interesting to me because in my opinion, now we're starting to get into the sweet spot. So let's keep going. I mentioned we're getting into the sweet spot, and we're at 40% now, and the control is so much better in my opinion. I don't have to pull back on the trigger near as far in order to get the paint to flow. Got nice even lines. They're not super straight and they're not 100% even, but the control is there. That's where I like to be. And finally, the 50% per volume reduction ratio. I didn't spend a lot of time on this, so it doesn't look that great, but the intent was never to make it look good. But there's a definite visual difference if you look at the performance of the 10% per volume reduction ratio compared to, say, the 50% per volume reduction ratio. Again, at 10%, the paint is obviously thicker, which means you have to pull the airbrush trigger back farther than you normally would just to get the paint to flow. And it's very inconsistent. It's hard to control. So the differences between, say, a 25 to a 50% per volume reduction ratio are minimal. You can't really see the differences visually, but you can feel it when you're actually spraying paint through your airbrush. Again, the paint is thinner, which allows you greater control, and you can actually work a little bit faster using a thinner paint. So you might be wondering, why did I take the time to show you guys all this if you can't really see the differences from a visual standpoint? Why didn't I just tell you from the beginning how to simplify reducing your paint? There's a couple of reasons. I've watched people struggle with this for years. And most of the time, in my experience, when I see somebody having issues with their airbrush not working quite the way they want it to, they almost always make an adjustment to the reduction ratio of their paint first. It's a really good idea to take a minute and make sure your airbrush is actually working correctly before you make any adjustments, whether it's paint or air pressure. You can do that simply by spraying water through the brush, just plain water. If you're not sure how to do that, I will link another video up here in the corner that goes over that. But here's the thing. If your airbrush is working correctly and you're anywhere within, say, that 25 to 50% reduction ratio range, you should be good, even if you're using a small tipped airbrush like a Micron or an equivalent. If your airbrush is working correctly and you're still having issues, I don't generally recommend that you make adjustments with your reduction ratio. The problem is, generally speaking, we're dealing with very small amounts of paint when we mix paint for our airbrush. If your paint is too thin, obviously you would want to add more pigment to thicken it up. If your paint is too thick, you would want to add reducer. When you're dealing with small amounts of paint, it's very easy to swing too far on either end of the spectrum, so you wind up with the actual opposite problem that you had previously. What I'm saying essentially is you can wind up chasing your reduction ratio, which can lead to frustration. I prefer to adjust my air pressure. I mentioned this earlier. If you spray just a circle with a nice fade from the overspray on the outer edges, you can judge how well your airbrush is atomizing your paint mixture. You can look at any of these circles and see the drops of paint are very fine with a nice gradated fade. That's what we want. Based on that information alone, I know that 25 psi is more than enough air pressure to atomize the paint in either one of those airbrushes, regardless of where I fall on this reduction ratio scale. I can safely drop my air pressure anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds, and more than likely 20 psi is still going to be plenty of air pressure to atomize my paint, whether I'm at 10% or 50%. On the flip side of that, if you're seeing large paint drops and you're not getting that smooth gradated fade, you can safely up your air pressure anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds. Repeat the same test and see if your results are better. Again, adjusting your air pressure is faster, it's easier, and you avoid chasing your reduction ratios. So to close this video out, let's talk about mixing our paint. There's a number of different ways you can mix your paint relatively accurately. I already mentioned I used a syringe to mix all the ratios for this particular video. This is great for mixing small amounts of paint relatively accurately. The downside is you have to clean it. Another option is to use an easy mix cup or an alternative. These have graduated marks on them. This one gives you anywhere from a 1:1 all the way up to an 8:1 ratio. The downside with using one of these is even the smallest ones are relatively large. This is about a 4-ounce cup. If you mix your paint in one of these, chances are you're going to wind up with way more paint than you actually need. Another option is a medicine cup. Medicine cups are cool because they too have graduated lines. The downside is these are designed for ingesting medicine, not mixing paint. So the actual number of these ratios that you'll be able to mix accurately with one of these cups may be a little bit limited. You can count drops of paint. Counting drops takes a long time. It's easy to lose count, and in my experience, the paint drop size coming out of the bottle is not always all that consistent. So let's just face it, most of us, and this includes myself, are lazy. We're going to mix our paint on the fly. We are going to guesstimate. Here's the problem. It's a lot harder to guesstimate about a 25% per volume reduction ratio compared to a 50% per volume reduction ratio. Does that make sense? Are you getting where I'm going with this? Again, keep it simple. It's not too terribly difficult to guesstimate a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 part paint, 1 part reducer. That's what I use for about 90% of what I do. I like to mix my paint in these clear little 2-ounce plastic cups that come with lids. These are good lids. They seal up well. I've kept paint for up to 2 months in one of these, and it's still sprayed fine after that. So again, keep it simple. I use a 1-to-1 paint mix ratio roughly, and my air compressor is set at about 25 psi for about 90% of what I do. Sometimes I like a little bit thicker paint if I want faster coverage. Sometimes I like it a little bit thinner if I'm doing very small details. But the vast majority of what I do, I'm using a 1-to-1 ratio at around 25 psi. Now I can't tell you guys that, yes, mix your paint at a 1-to-1 ratio and set your air pressure at 25 psi and boom, like magic, everything is going to work perfectly. It just doesn't work that way. There are too many other factors involved. Some we can control, some we can't. But for the vast majority of you, it will probably work just fine. So try it out. Let me know in the comments how it works for you. Keep in mind that a 1-to-1 ratio is a little bit thin too. You may need to slow down a little bit because it will be easier to flood the canvas with paint and possibly spider out. But give it a shot. See what you think. I hope you guys have got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'll leave links in the description below to the products that I've used and the products that I've talked about. Again, I'm an Amazon affiliate, so if you decide to make a purchase and you purchase something through one of those links, you're helping to support the channel, and I greatly appreciate that. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio, and I'll see you guys next time.